Değerli misafirler, tekrar hoş geldiniz. Kısa bir aradan sonra ilk oturumumuzla etkinliğimize devam ediyoruz. İlk oturumumuzun teması Küresel Kent Ağları çalışmalarında nicel ve nitel araştırma yaklaşımları. Bu oturumumuzda bizlere değerli katkılarını sunacak olan Yıldız Teknik Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Zeynep Endil maalesef son dakikada bir rahatsızlık yaşadığı için aramızda bulunamıyor. Kendisi özürlerini diletti. Biz de kendisine geçmiş olsun dileklerimizi iletiyoruz. Dolayısıyla ben sahneye şimdi Yıldız Teknik Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Asuman Türk'ün, Ghent Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Ben Deruder, Loughborough Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Doçent Doktor Allan Watson'ı davet ediyorum.
Herkese hoş geldiniz diyerek birinci oturuma başlıyoruz. Ezgi Hanım da ifade ettiği çok fazla vakit kaybetmeden ben söz vereceğim. Bahsettiğimiz gibi niceliksel ve niteliksel araştırma yöntemlerini konuşacağız ilk oturumda. İlk konuşmacımız Profesör Doktor Ben Deruder. Quantitative and qualitative research approaches in the City World Network research and positioning Turkish cities and Istanbul according to qualitative and quantitative research approaches. And ikinci konuşmacımız ise Doçent Doktor Allan Watson, Qualitative Approaches in the World City Network'ü sunacak. Ben hiç vakit kaybetmeyeyim. Aslında ben son dakika buraya gelmiş oldum. Oğuz Işık da rahatsızlanmış sanıyorum ama öğleden sonra bekliyoruz. Onun yerini almış durumdayım. Evet, ilk sözü Ben Deruder'e verelim. Konuşmasını dinleyelim. Çok çok teşekkür ederiz. Ee, 20 dakika, 25 dakika tutabiliyoruz. Daha sonra da 15 dakika tartışma zamanımız olacak.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks for the invitation, both from the municipality and also from İzmir University and Ceylan for organizing this session. It's really an honor for me to be here and introduce actually some of the research we have been doing. Now, the research doesn't focus on Turkish cities per se. It focuses on cities in general. But obviously what I would like to do here is take the example of Turkish cities to show how we actually approach our research, and very basically our research, or the research I'm presenting here, will focus on some of the things that have been touched upon in the previous talks, and that is how do Turkish cities stack up to other cities worldwide in terms of how they're globally connected. Okay, so that is the broad contours of that will be the broad contours of my talk today. Now, I have mentioned we, although I will be presenting the research. This is actually collaborative research as part of a broader research network with a couple of colleagues. So my talk will be centered on Turkish cities and Istanbul in particular in the World City Network 2010-2016. Let me very briefly explain my title, because that will be the gist of my talk. So what we mean by a World City Network in our research is, as we approach cities, we will approach them globally, hence World City. We're not going to look at cities in a national context. We're going to explicitly look at how they stack up to cities worldwide. So national economies only play in the background, so to speak. Then World City Network, the focus of our research is actually on how cities are connected. Okay, so the question will not be how big is Istanbul, how many headquarters are there, how many money is floating around, but specifically how well is it connected to New York London, Shanghai, and how does that compare to other cities in their connections to London, New York, Shanghai. The focus, therefore, is on relations between cities and how well cities are connected globally. So that is what the concept World City Network means in our research. And then the 2010-2016, we've got a couple of data sets. The most recent for 2016, I will focus on that one, but we can also look at changing trajectories of cities, because if you have different cuts in the data, you can also look how cities become more or less connected, where they gain connectivity, where they lose connectivity, and I will focus on 2000 and 2016 very briefly. Now, my presentation was initially quite academic, but I'll try to scale it a little bit down. I will not dwell too much on the methodology, the formulas, and so on, and I'll focus on the results. But I will try to give you a little bit of background on what we do, because as you make an interpretation of the results, obviously you need to understand what kind of data we use to come to those conclusions. So here are two books. On the left, an edited volume, and to the right, a written volume with a number of colleagues. And what I basically will do is summarize these books here in the next couple of minutes, and the results that are detailed in more specificity in both books. So both Allan and myself are part of the Globalization and World Cities Research Network. From now on, I will call that GOC. So if I refer to GOC, I refer to the research network. And some of the things we try to do is map and understand global intercity relations. As I mentioned on my first slide, we try to understand how Istanbul is related to Paris, to New York, to London, and so on. So we look at relations between cities, and we do that across borders. There's multiple research questions there, but I'll focus today on the mapping, okay? How well is Istanbul actually connected? That will be the focus of my talk. So the starting point for the methodology and the data is that we treat cities, any city, as a knowledge factory. So what is being created in Istanbul is a lot of different things, but one of the things that is produced here is knowledge on how to function in a global economy. So we're going to see cities as knowledge factories, and we're going to focus on the agents that produce that knowledge, okay? So the rise of cities, world cities, since the 1980s, such as has been mentioned by Jaylon in her talk, is actually a complex phenomenon which has to do with the increasingly large and global marketplace for services, accountancy, banking, legal services. So there's a global marketplace for that. Firms in New York do not cater to the US economy alone. They focus to a global economy. And this has in turn been facilitated by ICT, computers, airline networks, deregulation of the economic life, which may or may not have come to an end, as has been mentioned in the previous talk, wholesale economic globalization. So the idea is that cities are more and more operating in a global environment, and part of their function, not their only function, but part of their function is being a knowledge factory for the rest of the regional, national, global economy. Now, a lot of this knowledge is created by service firms, and we focus on a specific kind of service firms, which we call advanced producer services. That's the second abbreviation. So we've got GOC. The second one is APS. By APS, we mean Advanced Producer Services. And these are financial and business services, legal firms, advertising firms, law firms, logistics firms, and so on, who create the knowledge, who are the knowledge bearers and knowledge diffusers. Okay, so big service companies have their offices in major cities around the world. They diffuse knowledge, they exchange knowledge, and we will actually use that as a proxy for the intercity relations. So I'm almost down to the methodology. If we look at relations between, say, Istanbul and New York, the idea will be that you have a lot of offices of services firms, banks, accountants, legal service firms, who exchange knowledge between those cities, and that will be treated as a proxy for connectivity. This is very specific. This is only a very small segment of global connectivity, very clearly, but it's quite precise if you want to track how cities are interconnected, and this is what we focus on. So the most advanced, specialized and globalized of these firms have a network of offices centered on major cities, so KPMG, Bank of America, and so on. There will be in Istanbul to tap into the local knowledge and diffuse knowledge, and we will focus on these offices office firms as a proxy to see how globalized different cities are. So these are two pictures I took almost a decade ago at Amsterdam Airport, and this sums up quite nicely what we do. So it's an advertisement by Deloitte, which would be like a typical APS firm, taxation, accounting, and so on. And the message on the advertisement says it all. Fortunately, all capitals in the world have one thing in common. And what do they have in common? Deloitte is there. Of course, this is very specific. It's only one firm, but the idea, of course, is that all these firms show business people traveling through Amsterdam is that all those firms will be there. Does anybody doubt here that Deloitte will be present in London? No, it has to be there. You cannot not be there. So we use this information on the Deloittes of this world to track and map how cities are being connected to all the other cities. So on the left we have Amsterdam, on the right we have New York City. It's clear that both cities will be interconnected through Deloitte, and this is what we're actually going to map. So this would be another example, Amrop Heaver, a human resources firm, and the dots on the map are simply offices of Amrop Heaver. And what you see very classically, if you look at Australia, for instance, they have two offices. The two offices are in Melbourne and Sydney. These are the two major knowledge factories of Australia. So what we do, or what we will do, we will focus on different firms, look at those maps and derive information from those maps to see how cities are connected. Because the idea would be if the Australian economy further booms and there's a third knowledge factory, what would it be? Would it be Perth? Would it be Brisbane? That's what we're trying to track over space. Now, that's the general approach. Now I get to the actual methodology. How do we do this? Because this is the general idea. We use information like this. But how do we do this in practice? Now I do have two formulas. I have to apologize. I have to be academic. I need to have formulas. And the two formulas at the bottom actually explain how we measure connectivity between cities. Because there's no connectivity here. There's dots on the map. Okay? So how do you look at relations between cities? Well, what we actually do in our research is we value the dots. That's the first step. We look at how important the dots are. So global headquarters is more important than a normal office. A regional headquarters is more important than a normal office. So we value between 0 and 5 how important the presence of a firm is to a city. So the global headquarters of Deloitte is in New York. New York, Deloitte, 5. The regional headquarters for Europe is in Paris. 4. So we value the presence. And obviously, if a firm is not present in a city, it gets a 0. No connectivity. So that's the starting point. And then the second point is we look at connectivity, and what we basically do to get connectivity is we'll multiply the values I talked about to look at connectivity. What this basically means is that if you have a global headquarters in New York and a regional headquarters in Paris, that's a 5 and a 4. We simply multiply that. 5 times 4 is 20. That's a strong relationship between global headquarters and regional headquarters. 2 normal offices, 2 and 2. 2 times 2 is 4. So it's a smaller connection. So what we will basically need is information of the presence of a lot of firms in a lot of cities. We value these between 0 and 5. And then we put this into a model. And then the most important measure there is GNC. GNC stands for Global Network Connectivity. That is basically aggregating the connections I talked about across all cities, across all firms, and that gives you a measure of how well a city is connected. Now, this can be aggregated or complemented with a number of other measures. I will not go into the mathematical details, but I'll explain you the gist as I show results. That tells you how well a city stacks up to other ones. So what we will basically have is the global network connectivity of Istanbul, and we can compare it to other cities around the world or other cities in Turkey, and this is what I will do. So I won't dwell too long on this, but this is what we basically will have. We have a lot of cities, for instance, New York, Shanghai, Johannesburg, and so on and so forth. Then you have different firms, Deloitte, KPMG, Bank of America, and for each set of firms and cities will have a value that measures how important it is. So the global headquarters of New York, firm A, is in New York, while firm C does not have a presence in Shanghai and it gets a 0. You put it into the formulas and you get a measure of connectivity for cities as a whole and for city pairs. So this is what we do. So before I can go to the results, there's only one thing left for me to explain is, well, if you need this kind of information to do our research, how do you get that data? Okay, so how do you fill the matrix? So what we do is, or what we need to do is, we need to decide on cities, which cities to include, which firms to include, and also how to assign a value to a city. How do we decide that Deloitte is a 5 in New York? So we need to have the information on those service values, and we have been doing that a couple of times over time. First time in 2000, last time in 2016. Focusing on the latter one, what we do is, so first we have a selection of cities. We have all cities in the world with more than 1 million inhabitants. All cities with key economic importance, because some cities with less than 1 million inhabitants are really important. Luxembourg, Geneva, they need to be in there, so we also include those cities. So we have 707 cities in the data. Second, we need a selection of firms. We have different sectors: management consultancy, banking, finance, law, and so on. For each of these sectors, we use the most globalized firms, so the 25 biggest law firms in the world. And we look for 175 of those firms where they're connected. So we've got 707 cities, 175 firms, and for each of these we will look at the corporate websites where it's listed how important their presence is. So for a legal firm, it would be global headquarters, the number of partners, the level of expertise, and we assign standardized values, and then we put them into the model, and we got measures of connectivity. So this is broadly how we approach it. So results. So obviously we have results for 707 cities on not just the global connectivity measure, but a stack of other measures. So what I will not do is go through each of them, but I'll focus on some of the most notable results for 2016. So what we have on this first slide is the 23 most connected cities in the world. Okay, and then followed on by the rest of the Turkish cities. The reason for going down to number 23 is very obviously because number 23 is Istanbul. How do you need to make an interpretation of GNC, global network connectivity? We basically use like the most connected city in the world as 100%, and the rest of the percentages are basically the global connectivity of that city divided by the one from London. So London is the most connected city from that perspective. Now, what do we see? Once again, I won't run you through all of the details, but one of the things that recurringly shows in our research is that London and New York are in a class of their own. They're not just simply 1 and 2, but if you look at the actual values, 100% and 95%, once you go to city number 3, Singapore, there's a huge drop. So London and New York are like the quintessential world cities today in terms of their connectivity and business service firms. They tower over the rest. What we see next then is a mixture of Asian and European cities. So Singapore, Hong Kong, Paris, but also Beijing, Tokyo, and by now Dubai, which is really high up. I'll talk about changes later, but Dubai was nowhere to be seen in 2000, but by 2016 it is in the top 10 of most connected cities. So Istanbul is ranked 23rd at roughly 50% of London's connectivity, which makes it comparable, from our perspective, to the likes of Seoul, Toronto, Johannesburg, and Warsaw. So its volume of connectivity is comparable to those cities. Moving on to Turkey, what you really see, and I guess that's not another surprise, is that Istanbul, just like New York and London, are in a class of their own at the global scale. Istanbul is in a class of its own at the national scale. So it is much more connected than any other city from this particular perspective. So only Ankara gets a connectivity of more than 20%, which would be the cutoff point in most of our research, and Izmir, Bursa, and so on are much less connected. What that basically means is that those cities are connected, but they're only connected by, for instance, accountancy firms like Deloitte, who are basically everywhere. That's their source of connectivity, but their only source of connectivity. While for Istanbul, a lot of these global service firms are here and use that to connect to other cities worldwide. Now, I won't dwell too long on that map, but it's a great map to work on your geographical imagination, because this is actually a world map. So if you move from top left corner, that's actually North America, where you see VN, that's Vancouver. CJ, that's Calgary. And if you move to the bottom right, we're ending up in New Zealand and Australia, where BB means Brisbane, SY means Sydney, and so on. So what we basically show here is the uneven distribution of connectivity worldwide. Every city in our 707 cities with more than 20% of connectivity is labeled here. So in red you see the Turkish cities, so IS is Istanbul, NK is Ankara. And so what you basically see is uneven development in the world through city connectivity. Because what you see is Africa being quite small, with only a couple of cities making the threshold. You see a lot of well-connected cities in Asia and a lot of well-connected cities in Europe, with Istanbul and Ankara effectively taking the role midway between Asia and Europe in terms of connectivity. Now, I won't dwell on the formulas. I'll just go to the results, but first explain you what you can see here. So my previous table was global network connectivity, which is plain and simple: how many connections do you have? Every city is connected to 706 other cities, and you simply make a table of how connected they are. But that connectivity can have different geographical dimensions, and this slide and the next couple of slides focus on specific dimensions of those geographical dimensions. And this dimension, globalism, basically answers a very simple question. If we would not focus on all 706 cities, but only on the top 10 cities, how well connected are you then? Because you might argue, for instance, for Chinese cities, that if you're connected to a lot of other Chinese cities through the Bank of China, we call that global network connectivity, but it's not very global, actually. It's very national. Okay? So what we do here is simply focus on the relative importance of your connections to New York, to London, to Singapore, and Hong Kong only to the top 10, because it might be argued that it's strategically more important to be connected to those big capital markets than it is to cities further down the line. So this ranking shows you, rather than how well are you connected, all of a sudden the focus is on how well are you connected to the world's key cities. And so what you see is now is a city that wasn't mentioned in the top 23, Frankfurt, all of a sudden becomes one. Frankfurt is quite well connected, perhaps not as much as the likes of Sydney, but Frankfurt has connections to all the major cities worldwide, to New York, to London, to Paris, to Singapore. So it gives its connectivity an important strategic dimension. And what you see there is that the ranking starts shifting. While Toronto and Istanbul had the same connectivity, what you actually see is Toronto is much more strategically connected than Istanbul is. Istanbul is only ranked 61 now. So it has a lot of connections, but many of these connections are not necessarily to the top tier cities. Toronto is much better connected to London, New York, and so on than Istanbul is. So it's not just about being connected, but also having like a global dimension to that. And in that sense, Istanbul is actually lagging behind some of the other cities. So from 23 it goes to 61 all of a sudden. There's other dimensions. Localism is the obverse of globalism. How important are your local connections to the cities in your own country? Now, these values tend to be positive. You're always much more stronger connected to local connectivity. But what you see here is, if you take the example of Turkish cities, you see that Istanbul stands out not just because it's more connected, but it's less connected to Turkish cities than the other Turkish cities. So the least connected cities get their connectivity by being connected to the other Turkish cities, while Istanbul has much more global connections than the other Turkish cities. We've seen in the previous slide that it's not scoring very high, but compared to the other Turkish cities, Istanbul is not just more connected, but also much more global in its outlook of connectivity. A final measure is regionalism. Is you look at different world regions. How well are you connected to Asia? How well are you connected to Europe? And we do that through radar diagrams. Once again, not the formulas. And so this is for a couple of Turkish cities, and what you basically see, you see these different world regions around the radar diagram, and the further the line is out, the stronger the connection. So if it's really to the core of it, you're not really well connected to cities in that region. If you're very well out, you're very strong. Now, what do we see for Turkish cities in general and Istanbul in particular? The connections are really strong with Europe. So if Istanbul is very well connected through the office networks, its major connections are with European cities. Okay. Now there is diversity, because one of the things that sets Istanbul apart, so you see it has a strong connection to Europe, you see that for all of the Turkish cities, but also has an important component being connected to North American cities, which is totally lacking for say, Ankara. So Istanbul is much more connected through the office networks to Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York than other Turkish cities would be. Once again, I won't dwell on each of the radar diagrams, but what we see here is like a geographical analysis of where you're connected. So you got your global network connectivity, but you can disaggregate geographically to see where you're actually connected. Now, I will finish off with looking at change, as mentioned. What I presented is results for 2016, but connectivity has been changing. Cities are rising, cities are declining, cities are remaining stable in their connectivity. So if we compare 2010 with 2016, I give you the same map as before. And the map actually consists of two maps. So this is the first one. This is the second one. What's the difference? All cities getting a color here are more connected in 2016 than they were in 2016. So this is connectivity gain. And this is connectivity loss. So whatever is white here gets a color here and the other way around. Now, if you go back and forth between the maps, what you see here is something that has been mentioned in the previous talk. You see the rise of Asia. You see the rise of the East, because all of the cities losing connectivity tend to be in Northern America and in Europe. Okay, while you look at connectivity gains, they tend to be in Africa and in Asia. Okay, so you see that basic shift. Now, one of the important things here to note is that actually in that diverse geography, you see that actually Istanbul has been gaining quite a lot of connectivity over time. Ankara as well. So in terms of connectivity gains, Turkish cities in the last 6 years have become much more connected, and in that sense, so they're more connected to Europe, but they're more Asian in the sense that they become much more connected over time. Here you see the connectivity declines. Okay, so final slide. These are the major gains and losses. So it's Chinese cities and African cities that post to the left the most connectivity gains: Chengdu, Johannesburg, Riyadh. To the right you see the major losers, which are Dallas, Portland, Philadelphia, United States cities. And what we see is Istanbul here. If this is a top 23 again, what I've shown you, but one of the things that makes Istanbul stand out, it's ranked 23, but actually in the top 23, together with Johannesburg, it has been progressing most. So if that trajectory, we have to be prudent, of course, but if that trajectory keeps going on in the next couple of years, what you actually see is that Istanbul will rise the ranks of global connectivity if the last 6 years are a good predictor. And that's all for me. Thanks a lot.
Çok teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi ikinci konuşmamız doçent doktor Allan Watson'ı davet ediyoruz. Konuşma başlığı tekrarlayayım. Qualitative Approaches in the World City Network. Buyurun.
Great. Okay, so first let me apologise. As you might be able to hear, I've got a rather heavy cold, so I'm afraid my voice isn't brilliant. Excuse me, isn't brilliant this morning, but I'll try to get through as best I can without coughing too much. Let me also echo Ben's thanks for the invite. It's my first time here in Istanbul, actually, and it's somewhere I've always wanted to visit, so I'm very excited to be here. So what I hope to do is build usefully from Ben's talk. I think one of the things that we find as Gawk scholars is that we recognise that these quantitative rankings that Ben talked about today are in many ways very attractive to city policymakers, and it's exciting to see whether your city is up or down or whatever it might be, and to question why that might be indeed. So what I hope to cover today is to think a little bit how we might use qualitative research to complement and investigate further some of the findings that come from the quantitative analysis that Ben has shown us. To begin, I want to go back to the beginnings of the global city thesis and the work of Saskia Sassen, and just think for a second about what a global city actually is. So Sassen talks about the global city being one that contains the capabilities for servicing, managing, and financing the global operations of firms and markets. Because that's a reasonably straightforward definition. The question of, is a city a global city then, becomes one of whether there is coordination and specialised servicing of global firms and markets. So is that taking place? So at a basic level, if that's taking place, we're talking about a global city, at least according to Saskia Sassen. I think there are two very important implications from this in terms of the types of methods that we use to study global cities. The first of which is that it means we need to consider cities in terms of their relations. So certainly a long time ago in geography we moved away from considering cities as bounded entities to considering cities in regard to their relationships to each other. So here we're thinking about cities as more than the sum of their attributes or what's contained within them, but thinking about cities as they exist within networks of flows, and networks of flows of capital, of skills, of knowledge, of people, and so on and so forth. So for people like John Freeman, who was mentioned earlier, and for Saskia Sassen, cities only make sense if we see them in a relational perspective, and indeed that underpins what Ben's just presented, the idea of seeing cities in relation to each other and trying to come up with a quantitative methodology that captures those relationships. The second implication, though, I think, is that we, in order to get at those processes, we need to think about the methods we use, and I think we certainly need to adopt, and I say this in addition to, rather in place of, this isn't a critique of quantitative approaches per se, but thinking about qualitative approaches as being complementary to the quantitative research strategies. And I would argue that only through qualitative research can we really get to appropriately assess the management and governance relations between advanced producer services firms and their clients, but also, as I'll talk about in a moment, many other different types of global city actors too. There's a lot to be said for the quantitative work that we've developed over many years in Gawk. Undoubtedly, it's given us lots of new insights into the World City Network, lots of new empirical insights in terms of the ways cities are part of flows of capital and people and knowledge. And as Ben has displayed so beautifully in his presentation, the one thing I wanted to emphasize is what it does so well is to pick up pattern in the global economy. So you can see regional connectivities. You can see the shifts in those connectivities over time. It gives us an empirical representation of how the global economy is changing at this particular moment in time, and Ben spoke about the shift towards Asia. So the quantitative approach has taken us an awful long way in terms of understanding global cities. However, and it's quite significant, however, really, while the quantitative approaches have many strengths and they're very attractive, and they tell us a lot about the changing kind of patterns of globalization, they have little to tell us about more process or practice-based discussions which attempt to explain a number of key things about how global cities operate, how cities become global, become more connected. Excuse me. So the first of which would be, why do certain socioeconomic processes become located and performed in particular cities? So I'll speak more in a second about ideas of specialisation and diversity in the global city network. Why changes in connectivity are taking place? So Ben's mentioned changing connectivities, but why are those connectivities changing? We can see that they are through the quantitative work, but we don't understand why they are. And then thinking about flows. Flows are something of an abstract thing, aren't they? These flows that happen between cities of information and people. But these things are actually quite tangible. They are day-to-day practices. They are day-to-day operations. They are emails and phone calls and people moving and capital moving. These flows are made up of many, many, many micro interactions. So these flows are tangible things, and we can try to examine what those flows consist of, why they happen, and the kind of content and meaning of those flows. What is the knowledge that's being transferred? Why are people moving between particular cities for meetings, and so on and so forth? Also, as well, there's another limitation. As Ben has touched on, the way the quantitative approach works is to think about what's happening within these global firms. So essentially what we're mapping are intra-firm office networks, so the connections between one office and another within a firm, and we assume that those, probably appropriately, that those two offices are in some way talking to each other, or flows are happening between those two offices. That might work relatively well for large advanced producer services firms. But I think one of the things, and especially if we think about the way in which the economy is changing, that approach struggles to pick up some of the more kind of flexible forms of business arrangement, or what we might call non-presence. So when a firm isn't located within a particular territory, maybe isn't located within the city of Istanbul, but nevertheless has economic relations that reach out to the city. So I'll talk about this in a moment, but just thinking around things like strategic alliances, so between two different companies. Thinking about things like franchises, again, another form of non-presence. Capturing things like business travel. And particularly pertinent to my own research, which tends to focus more on kind of media and creative industries, are issues of ephemerality, or where project-based working means that these links come and go, sometimes very quickly. And that makes it rather difficult to trace things like change over time. But I'll come back to that in a second. So I guess what I'm trying to say in short is that while quantitative approaches have taken us an awful long way, they are not sufficient within themselves, not sufficient alone, for us to understand the very complex strategies and activities that are inherent in the organisation of a global firm, and the way those practices tie particular cities together. Again, Saskia Sassen actually re-emphasises this in a very recent article, and she emphasises how the global city function is made. Yeah, that it's a function that is made, that's created by people and their activities, and firms and their activities, and further that process of making the global city is actually very, very complex and multifaceted. So in order to get at those practices, we need some form of qualitative research. Yeah? If we're to understand, again, to paraphrase Sassen, practices that constitute what we call economic globalization. So that's the key message here, really, is thinking about what economic globalization is, thinking about what those flows are, and thinking about them in terms of the practices of certain economic actors. And there are all sorts of important actors as well, I think. So Ben's focused on advanced producer services firms, and they're arguably amongst the most important functions in the globalization of the economy. But there are all sorts of other actors that are involved in the making of a global city as well. As by way of a little plug, in a forthcoming edited collection that a couple of Gawk scholars have been working on, called Global City Makers, we try and focus or reorientate global cities research on that process of making the global city and thinking about the diversity of actors, including advanced producer services, but also moving beyond them, and the way those actors and their practices, their agency create the global city. So just quickly thinking about APS, but also politicians and city mayors, planners. We have contributions on real estate, logistics, transnational professionals who travel and settle in particular cities, all in their own way contribute to the making of the global city. The qualitative approaches then are sensitive to that complexity. They try to capture that complexity. Importantly, as human geographers, we try not to forget the human element of our work, and so we're interested in the associations between different people. And the commitment, I think importantly in this context, to understand the perspectives of those actors. How do key actors in APS firms or city politicians, planners, understand changes that are happening in that city? How do they change strategy, adapt, adopt, change their practices in response to particular factors, to try to develop strategies to bring cities into the global economy? So I guess what I'm arguing for really then is if we think of quant work as being kind of top-down, is thinking about how we can come bottom-up with our research as well, through doing qualitative work with these key actors, interviews and so on, and sectoral reports, understanding different actors and different businesses, to try and develop a global city theory or an understanding of global cities that's grounded in the practices of those people. One of the key concerns of qualitative research is to allow the voices of the people that you're researching to come forward and let their voices take precedent. So to understand how they understand the work that they do in making the global city. Excuse me. Let me be a little bit more specific about that then. I think there are perhaps three key ways in which qualitative work can help us to understand how global cities are made. So the first, which I've touched on, is about the actual practices, okay? Not assumed practices or assumed flows, but what are the actual practices? What are people actually doing? What are the things that actually constitute flows? What are the strategic decisions that are being made? When we talk about global city function as being one of control, command and control, about exercising that control, how is it exercised? How are advanced producer services the means for the management of control of global operations? And we can still talk about change, how are those practices changing over time? The second, I think, is, and Ben and colleagues have done some amazing work in this area, thinking about issues of diversification and specialization in the World City Network. So why do particular types of economic activity function in some places over and above others? It might be, when we think about breaking down APS, it might be banking, it might be finance, it might be law, it might be advertising. What we actually see is quite a lot of specialization in centres across the world. Again, the quant work allows us to map that, to identify what that specialization is and where it exists. But we need qualitative work if we're to understand why that particular specialization exists in particular places. And then finally, I wanted to come back to this because I think this is really important, is to think about the ways in which we have these non-present strategies, or increasingly the way in which we have companies are operating in more flexible and temporary ways in the global economy. So in my own research on media and the creative industries, for example, much of the activity isn't necessarily based around large firms, and even if it is, the organizational strategy tends to be very project-based. So we have this configuration of teams that come together for a period of time, maybe geographically dispersed, that come together for the duration of the project. They deliver the project, and while that project is operating, we consider there being flows between different places, but then that project dissipates when the project is finished. So those flows are much more ephemeral. They are less long-lasting, but equally as important. So these are ways in which the economy is changing, but still increasingly important ways in which cities are connected to each other. And we've been experimenting with different ways of trying to capture that, for example, through qualitative work, but also through things like social network analysis. There are issues there, of course, around freelance labour and so on. And I think increasingly even the world's biggest firms are looking for that kind of flexibility, and we need to understand why they're looking for that kind of flexibility and how we might capture that. And at the moment, our quantitative work is a little limited, I think, in terms of responding to that particular change in the global economy. Excuse me. Okay. As I said from the outset, my intention was not at all to develop a critique of the quantitative approaches, but to think of qualitative work as being complementary. So I think even if you are attracted to and persuaded by the quantitative rankings, the qualitative work allows us to understand why particular cities are positioned within these hierarchies. So why is Istanbul 31st? Was that right, Ben? 31st? So why is Istanbul 31st? Importantly, I think, if we're thinking about change, how does it allow us to capture the ways in which this position can potentially change? Ben spoke about the new version of this book, World City Network, the book in which Peter Taylor, who I studied under at Loughborough, laid out the model that Ben's talking about, and many of you, of course, will be familiar with his work. If you actually read the preface to his book, he although the quantitative model has been criticised from many quarters, Peter's very clear that he only ever intended the quantitative work to provide the kind of extensive research by which we could understand change and patterning in the economy, and that it was always intended that quantitative work would provide the context for more intensive qualitative research into intercity processes. So Peter's intention was very much that we would use qualitative research to complement, to refine our understandings from the quantitative work, but also maybe to challenge those findings as well, and maybe to understand some of the limitations to our model. Excuse me. Let me close then by making something of a case in point. So Ben spoke briefly about the changes in connectivity of Istanbul as a city, and some of you who may be familiar with the way in which the GORC rankings are presented will know about alpha, beta, gamma, and the fact that we have a group of the world's most connected cities, which are called alpha. The second category is beta, and so on down through gamma. And New York and London, which Ben mentioned, are alpha plus plus up here. Just looking very, very briefly at the results from 2004 to 2016 though, I noticed that in 2004, Istanbul was down in the middle of the beta category, and in 2016 it's now very safely above middle in the alpha category. So what does this mean? Well, largely I imagine from the perspective here, locally in Istanbul, this is seen to be a good thing. Hopefully, from Bren's presentation, you understand what this actually means, the way in which this ranking is produced around advanced producer services, and Istanbul becoming more connected into these networks. But these kind of increases in ranking are kind of difficult to celebrate in a way too much, because we don't really necessarily understand what underpins this without qualitative research. And I think what's interesting is, does it really just represent the tip of an iceberg does APS represent the tip of an iceberg in terms of a whole range of different functions, a whole range of different activities that might be better embedding the city of Istanbul within global networks. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Andrew Jones, and he's written about global work, and I think that's a nice framing for what we're trying to get at. So when we think about practices and we think about networks, and we think about the work of individuals, Andrew Jones talks about this global work. And this global work is boundary spanning. It's the sorts of work that reaches out beyond the city of Istanbul and connects it to other cities across the world. As I mentioned, this isn't some kind of abstract flow or some kind of abstract office network, but it's the day-to-day activities of strategic business actors that are incorporating the city of Istanbul into these global accumulation processes. But anyway, I'm on my last slide anyway. So I want to close on a key question then. So if we were to think about undertaking qualitative research on global city Istanbul, how might we frame that research? And I think the key question might be this, and again I'm borrowing a little bit from Andrew Jones here. So how do the practices of a range of key global city makers, and I've touched on just a few today, but a whole host of different global city makers, I think it's important that we go beyond APS, for example. How do a range of global city makers in and beyond Istanbul, so one of the things that we can't do is focus solely on activity and people operating within the city of Istanbul, because they build relationships over distance with people and actors operating in the other major centres as well. So there are two things there. How do these actors legitimate and control and coordinate their activities? How do they do this on a day-to-day basis? And how does that inform the sorts of strategic decisions that link Istanbul into the global city network? And also, very importantly, I think this is where qualitative research comes into its own, is thinking about issues like relational proximity. I guess what I'm talking about there is the development of relationships of trust that happen across and between cities, the relationships that form business networks and links from Istanbul out to the rest of the world. How do actors go about building that trust? What are the kind of barriers to that kind of trust? So only through qualitative research, I think, can we begin to answer that particular question. But nevertheless, it's a really important one. That's it. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederiz. Sanıyorum bir 15 dakika sorular için var ama yemek saati de yarım olarak ifade edilmiş. Ama sanıyorum bir 5-10 dakika herhalde sorulara zaman ayırabiliyoruz. Bir şey mi verilecek acaba? Bir bakabilir misiniz?
Merhaba. Ben Zafer Murat Çetintaş, İstanbul Çevre Konseyi adına burada bulunuyorum. Şimdi Bay Bain ve diğer arkadaşımızın yaptığı çalışmada Türkiye'nin 23. sırada dünya kentler arası...
Bir pardon, bekleyebilir miyiz? Bir sorun oldu sanıyorum.
This one's 6 English, okay?
Okay, yeah, that one. Okay.
Bay Bain ve arkadaşının yaptığı çalışmayı inceledim. Katılmadığım yerleri kendilerine söylemek istiyorum ve eksik buluyorum. Dünya kenti olan...
Çok özür diliyorum. Yani duymak şart çünkü.
Sorry, yeah, we're not getting any translation at the moment.
Bir dakikam gitti.
Evet. Şeyde bir sorun var. Kulaklıkta.
Well, we hear something that's on the channel.
6. It's supposed to be on 6, but it's just not getting any English through there. No, it's just quiet.
You just hear whatever they're doing.
Devam edeyim. Diğer arkadaşı çevirir. Zaman kazanalım.
Bir bekleyelim lütfen. O çok daha zor olacak.
Bunu verin hanımefendi. çevirmiyor.
Fine. Okay. Yeah, there we go. Yes, thank you.
Peki, Bay Bain ve arkadaşının yaptığı çalışmayı inceledim ve Dünya Kenti sıralamasında Türkiye'nin 23. sırada olduğu tezini çürütmek için bir şeyler söylemek istiyorum. Şimdi yapılan araştırmanın sanıyorum karasal kökenli yapıldığı, uluslararası bu araştırmanın karasal kökenli olduğunu görüyorum. Çünkü bugün dünyada uluslararası ağı kuran Dünya Deniz Ticaret Filosu'dur ve Dünya Deniz Ticaret Filosu tüm bu bilgi birikiminin ve lojistik her türlü taşımacılığın %87'sine sahiptir. Ve bu dünya deniz taşımacılığındaki %87'lik paya Türkiye %83 ile sahiptir. Nasıl? 1926'da imzalanan Montreal Anlaşması'nda başta İngiltere ve Çin olmak üzere 36'da imzalanan Çin ve İngiltere olmak üzere 20 ülke Türk Boğazlar Tüzüğü'ne imza koymuştur. Niçin? Globalleşme, kentleşme adına bu yapılmıştır. Bugün dünya devi ExxonMobil'in yılda 250 milyon ton ham petrolü Tengiz'den Norilsk'e pompalanarak Türk boğazlarından geçmektedir ve Türk boğazlarından yılda 56 bin gemi geçmektedir. Sadece Karadeniz'e kıyısı olan 6 ülke ve arkasında bulunan 20 ülkenin tüm lojistiğini Türk boğazları sağlamaktadır. Yani 23. sırada gösterdiğiniz Türkiye sağlamaktadır. Oysa Moskova ilk 16'da. Moskova'nın bugün Türk boğazlarının önemi olmasa Moskova'nın ekonomik ve stratejik önemi birdenbire yok olur. Herhangi bir bu Türk boğazlarında yaşanacak olası bir facia karşısında. Dolayısıyla dünya ile entegresik ortadan kalkar. Çünkü ekonomisinin büyük bir bölümü buna bağlı. Bu bağlamda
bilir misiniz acaba mümkünse?
Bir açıklama getirerek sormak istiyorum. Yine bu göz ardı edemeyiz. Yine bu 56 bin geminin dışında Türkiye Deniz Ticaret Filosu'na bağlı 1200 gemi bulunmakta. 650 tanesi bunun direkt yurt dışında çalışmaktadır. Ve Türkiye'de lojistik sağlayan, bu gemilere lojistik sağlayan ulusal ve uluslararası 200 tane şirket bulunmaktadır. Bu son derece önemlidir. Yani içme suyundan tutun haberleşme cihazlarına kadar bütün lojistiği dünya ile entegreli bir biçimde Türkiye yapmaktadır. Yani yine son yıllarda İstanbul borsasının Londra borsasının bile önüne geçmesini de göz ardı etmemek gerekir. Bu bağlamda Türkiye'nin bu değerlendirmeler içerisinde ta Cenevizlerden günümüze kadar gelen dünya taşımacılık filosunda dünyayı birleştiren aktör konumunda olması çok önemlidir. Nitelikli araştırma yaparken yine bu kentin nitelikli aktörlerine görüşülerek yapılmalıdır. Ben bu araştırmanın deniz taşımacılığına yani karasal kökenli olduğunu görüyorum. Deniz ağırlıklı olmasının altını çiziyorum. Dolayısıyla bu soruya bir anlamda bunu sormuş oldum ve katkı koymuş oldum. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederiz. Buyurun.
Okay, so this is on. Okay. First of all, let me say that, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is like part of the research we've done. So people have done this. So if you look at the literature, there's people, especially in Paris, taking a naval, what you would call a naval approach, in that they focus specifically on connections between cities through shipping. At the same time, I don't think it's correct to say that we took a land-based approach. It wasn't clearly not a sea-based approach, but it's more like how do service firms organize themselves. Now, interestingly, there's a group of researchers who's done this kind of research from our perspective, focusing on service firms, but focusing on maritime services. So not just legal firms, but legal firms specializing in securing shipping, in financing shipping. Now, interestingly, what they found in the research, when they used the exact same approach we used. And so what is interesting, if you compare their rankings to us, now what happened there is that you see two sets of well-connected cities. The first set of well-connected cities is where port cities, the naval-based approach, that come to the fore. So for instance, in Greece, all of a sudden you see Piraeus popping up as a well-connected node. In Belgium you see Antwerp, in the Netherlands you see Rotterdam as port cities, which are clearly have a function to their city that is related to the port in organizing all sorts of global dimensions. But the second group of cities, and I think this is an important point to make, is that even for maritime services, for the logistic organization of all this, some of these well-connected cities weren't port cities at all. They weren't naval at all, at least not in the contemporary sense. So what you see is the most connected city in maritime services today is London. It wouldn't pop up on any kind of map of being globally connected as a port. But even then, maritime services who focus on shipping around, they do go away. Moscow is on the map. Okay, maritime logistics firms are in Moscow. They're not clear to close to the ships, but they're tapping into the knowledge factories in terms of organizing it. So I would say that implicitly it is in our rankings, because a lot of logistics, even port-based logistics, is carried out in non-port cities. And at the same time, as you mentioned, and I agree there, is that we took a very specific approach. You can complement it, for instance, with what you've mentioned, but there's other dimensions. You could look at cultural cities, at non-governmental organizations, which all have a different map in terms of how they organize globally. And ideally, you have these maps, you look at how they overlap, how they complement one another, and how they're different. And it's clear today in a trade-based world that indeed shipping and shipping networks are really important.
Başka soru da alabiliriz varsa salonda. Sanıyorum yok. O zaman pardon.
Asım Gelen. Hocam benim sorum konuklarımıza şu. Önümüzdeki yıllarda hizmete girecek 3. havalimanı, Kanal İstanbul, Ataşehir'de finans merkezi, bir kuşak bir yol projesi, TANAP ve Mavi Akım projelerinin devreye girdikten sonraki İstanbul'un projeksiyonunu nasıl görüyor konuklarımız? Teşekkür ederim.
I didn't get the file, but I didn't get the actual question.
How do you see the perspective, for example, after the construction of third bridge, airport, and crazy kind of?
Of course, that's a very general question, and it would be outright arrogant of me to come in from somewhere else, come to Istanbul and say there's a third airport, and yes, that'll be great. So that's something I cannot do. The only thing I can do as a scientist is refer to the research that is out there on relationships between infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure in particular on the one hand, and economic connectivity as measured in our research on the other hand. So people have been doing research in terms of, like if Allan says we don't know an awful lot about why the changes are there, and we need to understand the why. That is obviously correct, but you could also try to answer the why question quantitatively if in some sort of model. Now, what we found is, or not just we, but other people have found, is that connectivity, and especially air transport connectivity, has been closely connected, correlated with the kind of connectivity we measure. So I'm not going to go into details, but we once did a correlation between our connectivity measures and all sorts of indicators. So how many people live in a city, because you could assume that Istanbul's connectivity has something to do with the fact that millions of people live here, quite simply. So we correlated with all sorts of other indicators. Now, the strongest indicator or strongest predictor of GOG connectivity is actually airport connectivity. So the more your airport is connected, and also not just connected, but strategically connected to the Frankfurts, the New Yorks, and so on, that has had an impact. It's hard to assess why that is. Is it actually because Istanbul becomes more connected, that more people want to take a flight from here or elsewhere? Or is it the other way around in causality, that an extended airport leads to more connectivity? That's an important question, of course. But indeed, based on our research, you can expect to have a correlation in the sense that more connections, not just the airport, it's about the connections from that airport, clearly will have some sort of impact. But it's hard from a policy perspective. It's very hard to see whether that is the cause or the effect. Do you need a third airport because there's demand? Or will the airport actually lead to more demand in the Istanbul metropolitan area? So there's a correlation, but causality in infrastructure and connectivity is always very hard to assert.
Is that working? Oh yeah, okay, great. Just to add very briefly to that, I think that it's an interesting question Ben poses about causality in the case of airports. But I think either way, it's really important to understand the motivation and the needs for people to travel. This is essentially what the airport's providing, but there must be some underlying motivational need or economic need for people to travel. In fact, there's been a kind of one of the qualitative elements of GORC work. John Beaverstock, James Falkbridge and yourself, I think, was on global business travel and the function that business travel still has in the global economy, and the importance of face-to-face interaction, in particular aspects of economic activity, such as the old-fashioned kind of sealing the deal, but also the development of trust relationships over space. So I think it's really important when we think about those infrastructure elements to also think about the kind of the motivations, the needs for travel, etc.